So, hey, I'm Brett Marquard. I'm a consultant that does a mix of kind of standards development and implementation of the FHIR standard. My background is in the kind of EHR implementation space, to kind of developing interfaces. I'm kind of in the V2 flavor and then CDA, and then of course FHIR today. But have spent a lot of time doing standards development. And in the US market, I've been responsible for our kind of US core specification, and also right now serve as the kind of project manager for Argonaut. So in terms of an outline today, we'll do a background on Argonaut, talk about some of our key prior initiatives, our 2023. I'll talk a little bit about our process of how we select projects, and then talk about the future. So really quick, what is the Argonaut project? So we think of ourselves as an implementation community focused on advancing FHIR and OAuth in the healthcare community. It's interesting to say this now because we've been around about 7 years. This is kind of a very novel FHIR had been 2 or 3 years old or 4 years old when the Argonaut project formed. This was kind of a novel concept, but in the US market, it was the first place to really start to drive adoption of the FHIR standard. We are private sector funded and initiated, so there's no kind of government funding for the Argonaut project. And our whole mission is to create open industry implementation guides to kind of solve problems that are common to our customers. And so one of the things I think is unique about our project, and there's a kind of a variety of these things in HL7 that are now called accelerators, is we're happy to pick up other work that's been done in the industry, but maybe hasn't gone far enough. And so you'll hear about Smart on FHIR. Smart on FHIR had some momentum. We thought it was a great project. And so we thought as a community, we would test it further. CDS hooks, clinical decision support hooks. There'd been a small community forming, and the Argonauts said, hey, let's all kind of put some of our resources behind it to test it out and grow the product. And recently with international patient access, we're not the owners or the starters of the IPA, but we helped get that published and validated at HL7. And so it's important to note that Argonaut is not a standards development organization. We're not a legal entity, or there's nothing kind of proprietary about what we do. And for folks who are here, at DevDays, it's important to think that behind DevDays, there's we got FHIR helping run DevDays, but there's a whole other organization, HL7, who's responsible for FHIR and the community around that, doing the development of the standard. In terms of membership, you can see we have a mix of kind of leading technology vendors, and these are some are US based but have an international presence. So kind of all the major EHRs in the US market, including Apple Health, kind of on the client side, and then there's a kind of they're not quite a payer, but they serve payer as Optum Health. And another kind of key part of our project is the provider organization. So anytime you have any technical specification, having a clinician or kind of partnering with a clinical organization is critical to make sure what you think is going to work actually does work in the real world. So a bit on timelines of, where do we come from? We were, I don't know if I'd say fortunate, but there was in the US, there was a group called the JSON report. And so it's an independent group of advisors. So at the senior government level, looked across our healthcare sector and said, hey, you guys it's archaic. You have, everyone has their own kind of old infrastructure. It's time to have a common unified architecture with open APIs and kind of dreamed of this greenfield approach. And the community who'd served the clinics and hospitals said, oh, hold on, guys, this is a pretty, a common unifying architecture. We've got, thousands of customers installed. And so a task force grew to say, all right, how do we respond to this report that's been written about our industry? And they said, all right, let's pull apart some of the best pieces of that report. And one part of that report was the call to having open API access to health information. And they said, hey, this isn't such a bad idea. Like, this could be good for the entire industry and, would serve our customers well is ultimately what they work towards. And so in December of that year, there was the launch of the Argonaut project. And so that's a very short time frame to say, hey, this report came out in May, there was a task force formed, recommendations, and boom, we had this project. And we were fortunate in the following year, and I don't know, in international markets, I know it's a little bit different about how regulation works, but in the US market, we had a regulation come out that required and actually made a requirement for an API. Okay. And what was unique about that requirement for the API is our government did something they hadn't done in the past, is they didn't actually name a standard. They named the characteristics to say, every EHR has to have an open API, and you have to publish the documentation on how people access it. And as a result of doing that, it allowed the industry to say, hey, what makes sense? And so not every vendor implemented FHIR. Some vendors said, hey, we have all these core APIs. We're going to share these APIs with the community and publish documentation, and that's going to be enough. Some of the other vendors said, hey, let's actually look at FHIR as being the API. So everyone does the same way to access patient allergies medications. And so, but that criterion gave the US market a little bit of flexibility. And we're in a similar spot with some of the current regulation in the US where, you know, subscriptions or CVS hooks or these kind of huge kind of standards about, you know, they're big standards and you know, trying to mandate the whole thing is a little bit confusing. And so allowing the market to kind of shake out exactly how everyone's going to do it. And we're fortunate to fast forward to, you know, 2023, the market has selected FHIR and new regulation does require FHIR. But in 2015, that wasn't necessarily the obvious decision. So the Argonaut project kept rolling. As part of that, we wrote our first kind of data query implementation guide. So a set of profiles, constraining FHIR, and then projects kept coming in terms of folks wanting to do more work. So we did a guide on provider directory. We started both CDS hooks, which I'll talk a little bit more in a bit. And so from kind of 4 short years from the beginning of Argonaut to market adoption, we had this network of networks called Carry Quality, which stitches together kind of various health information exchange or communities, implement our provider directory. There's another network called Commonwealth that used some of our core services for document reference access, and then Apple integrated into their Apple Health records. That's great. That's 4 years ago. Kind of the question is, you know, so what has Argonaut done lately? And we continue on here. And so we actually supported CDS hooks doing a ballot. We defined guidance for clinical notes. So if you're in a market where you're trying to figure out how do you access clinical notes, there is guidance in the Argonaut guide and US core on how to do that because of the FHIR core specs a little bit light. We did a whole section on provenance of kind of recording, you know, who last updated that information or who's responsible for that information. Clinical data subscriptions, you know, great talk yesterday about that. Something that was supported through the Argonaut project. And then we were fortunate, and there was this new regulation called the CHIRS rule. And the CHIRS rule actually not recommended, required the adoption of FHIR and required the adoption of US Core 311. And that went into effect last December. So in the entire US market, every hospital and clinic, so if you're trying to write a client application in the US market, all the hospitals have to support the US Core 311 version, and it's available and out there. And actually, patients are allowed to bring their own apps. There's different interpretations of how vendors support that, but patients are allowed to bring their own apps and connect and use Smart App Launch. 2021, we did some additional work on Smart on FHIR, more subscriptions work, more US Core work. So it brings us to kind of last year of things we wrapped up. So first is FHIR endpoint and structure. How do you find the FHIR endpoint that you want to connect to? It's a challenge, right? So one of the funny things in the US, again, it's funny to think about where things were regulated versus things people did on their own. One of the things that was regulated is you had to publish where your hospital FHIR endpoints are. Does anybody have a requirement like that in their country? How do you find your FHIR endpoints? Like, how do you find the hospital to connect to? It's a hard problem, right? So in the US market, what happened is different vendors did different things. So one vendor did like a nice custom JSON file. One vendor looked at the FHIR spec and said, hey, endpoints, like let's just use the endpoint resource. One vendor did an HTML website, one did an Excel file. And so the cost of like new consumer apps going, hey, how do I connect to your EHR? Every EHR posts this information a little bit differently. And some EHRs felt more pain than others, so they'd say, you know what, let's come up with a standard way to publish this information so everyone can, this shouldn't be a competitive thing, right? It should make it easy for client apps to find. So we did this project called it was called FHIR Endpoint and Structure, but we actually, the name morphed a bit to be Patient Access Brands. And what happens in regions of our country, we have many St. Mary's hospitals or St. Joe's. So we have these common, I don't know if you have these common names in your countries. And so to help a patient find the actual hospital to connect with, it's important to not just have the name, but then a logo that goes with it. And so, and actually, you know, the right size logo. that you can view on an app. I don't know what the exact pixel size was, but people did some crazy stuff. So the patient can then find it. So if you're in Apple Health, when you pull up Apple Health and you scroll through and say, oh, this is my health system, and connect, you can actually connect and download your data. Another thing that came up is we had this requirement for electronic health information. So everything in your record, and again, this is US market requirements, but these things would be applicable to other folks if you had similar things. Patient access brands absolutely is applicable around the world. Electronic health information there's a requirement now this year. You have to give the patient everything, not just what's in FHIR, not the things that are standardized, but everything. And then you have to publish what you just gave them, okay? I'm still not sure what I'm gonna do with this, but it's gonna happen this year. And this was a project to say, hey, let's not make some kind of weird paper or portal request. Let's actually make an API to standardize how this is done. So a few vendors tested it. We'll see if this becomes kind of a formal spec in the future, but it was just guidance that we want to roll out, and because ultimately we believe that folks will want to request this via an API. Another one from this year is called FHIR Right App State. It's kind of a funky name, but the way to think of this one is you have on your phone, your maybe your personal health record, or using Apple or the Android platform, and you want to share that with your provider. This is a way to write a small piece of app state to the EHR, and then the EHR can have their kind of companion app that opens and uses that piece of information to download and interact with your record directly in their EHR. And we think this is going to be a really nice launching point for doing future FHIR Right. And actually, Apple had partnered with 5 different vendors and rolled this out through a large part of the country. And so this was an opportunity to standardize some of the work they did. The next one is Smart Health Links. Who's heard of Smart Health Links? Have you heard of this? Okay, this is one of these projects it's like slowly growing, and I think has a lot of opportunity. So the QR code, for folks who had COVID vaccine and had to have a vaccine credential, that QR code embedded all the vaccine information directly in it. So you could see the vaccines that were given, date, time, all the information. Well, those QR codes are limited to how much information they can actually contain. And so the idea came, hey, what if instead of embedding everything in that QR code, it linked out to a third-party repository or somewhere, maybe in an EHR, to then download that information? And so Smart Health Links is this way that you'll see a presentation later today on how to share the IPS, International Patient Summary. There's talks about how to use that to download a full immunization record. And so this is one of these things that I think is a slow burning way of the patient helping kind of mediate the exchange and then directly connecting them to their health data. And I think I should check, there may be a talk later in this week, but if not, there's several recorded talks online done by Josh Mendel. In terms of publications, 2022, we did publish a few subscriptions publications, an update to US Core, CDS hooks. We do love international patient access. We see a lot of promise in that specification. And then we did some new works on US CDI. And I'll talk about what US CDI is in just a minute. Okay, so there are a lot of prior initiatives, and I can't, when I thought about this presentation, there's a funny balance here of like breadth versus depth. I probably could talk about any one of these projects for longer than most of you would want to be here for. And so the approach has been, all right, let's try to give you a kind of a snippet overview across all these, and or at least the ones in bold today, and then you can decide which ones are relevant to your world. So the first is Smart on FHIR. So this is the idea of access and authentication into a FHIR server. This is an open standard. It was actually developed kind of pre-Argonauts, but hadn't had testing and broad deployment. And so one of the first projects the Argonaut community did was do kind of a security audit of the specification and help refine it down, and ultimately supported this through formally validating the HL7. So again, we talk about the HL7 being kind of this organization that is responsible for FHIR. They have very supportive in trying to kind of this kind of formal ballot process, which it's a lot of work, but it gets you kind of critical feedback and makes you kind of finally, lock down and ship your product. I don't know if to use it. At some point you got to be done, and that ballot process helps a lot. And so we've done a 2.0 release, which includes granular permissions. The original Smart on FHIR, you would kind of grant scopes to say all the patient's observations or all of their lab, all their lab results or all a set of information. The granular permissions in 2020 allowed the ability to say, hey, I'm only going to give you permissions for this type of lab results or this type of kind of smoking status set of observations. And so the app could then just download that. For folks who are looking for more details on Smart FHIR, there's actually a great talk done by Josh yesterday, but the good news is it's actually recorded online. And so you can check that out at a later date. Another one is data document query. Every country should have an effort where they define profiles for data and document query. Your whatever it's your country's core, your country's base. It's really important to have this kind of de facto agreement across all FHIR servers of here's how we're going to share problems. Here's the terminology we're going to use. Here's the expectation on statuses, dates. And so we built the original kind of data query guide back in 2015. All the Argonauts worked to agreed to implement it. It included clinical notes guidance, included provenance, and a big piece of it, there's this funny word called must support. Who's heard of the word must support? And yeah, all right. So what's funny about must support is I think we've rewritten that like 6 times now. So, and the reason being the FHIR base standard says like, let the IG define what must support is. And when we first started, we said, send it if you have it, that's must support. And later we learned like there's all nuances of data absent rules. But if you want a very robust definition, I can't say it's a perfect definition, but we've spent a lot of time rewriting that in the US core specification because we've gotten lots of feedback from implementers about being very prescriptive about what it means. Okay. Just a second, mute someone here. Thank you. Oh, and US core. So this grew into our national standard, the US core. This is a formal standard validated through HL7. It's superseded the Argonaut guides. And so we no longer have Argonaut data query profiles. It's all part of our national US core standard. And we're really we benefit from something in the US called the US core data for interoperability. And so what this is our national government, once a year now, they actually take feedback from the community. They publish a draft set of new elements in January, and they finalize those elements in July. And so in between kind of January and April, anybody can comment to say, hey, this element isn't captured, providers don't use this. And then in July, they lock it in. And throughout the entire year, they take feedback on elements that they think would be good candidates for future versions of USCDI. And this has been incredibly helpful for driving the community to have kind of detailed discussions on how we would exchange this information and ultimately drive US core. And I think some of the stuff you look at and think is pretty straightforward. But then there's some that, like, you think, all right, how hard is it to exchange procedure information? Well, that's pretty straightforward. But then we have some of these interesting classes like social determinants of health assessments. Like, how do you assess someone who has housing insecurity or food insecurity or transportation? And so some of these they read fairly simple, but kind of the complexity of agreement on how we're going to do that takes a whole bunch of time. But that is what has kind of led some of the requirements to USCDI, led some of the requirements to US core. And ultimately, if you go in that spec, there's a mapping in there. And if you have a national body to set priorities, it's incredibly helpful to have a good relationship with them so that they don't make requirements that you can't actually meet, or you meet in kind of a, how do I say, less than ideal fashion to kind of like check the box, but then it doesn't actually move the market forward in a meaningful way. Okay, another big one is FHIR bulk data. How do you enable FHIR to population level data access? So, you want to update your clinical data warehouse, maybe for research, maybe for public health reporting. There's a really cool project about exchanging rosters, like lists of patients with the payer or the insurance provider on who's taking care of these patients. And so this is kind of, again, one of these foundational specifications that serves a whole variety of purposes, not meant for a specific use case. There's been a lot of connectathon testing on this. It's universal realm. And there's going to be a great talk by Dan Gottlieb later today if you want to get a lot of detail into bulk data. Subscriptions, this is a funny one. Just tell me when data has changed is really what this boils down to. The Argonauts have picked this up more than once. There was a project in 2019 and 21, and give Gino Canessa a ton of credit in terms of developing new resources for this on subscription topic and status. So you describe the thing you actually want to subscribe to, like updates for new encounter notification, new lab results can be described to the subscription topic. And then did a lot of work to make this available in different releases of FHIR. I think many of us, there's a FHIR versioning talk going on now, which many of us will probably go watch later. But Gino did kind of a lot of gymnastics to try to make, or stretch himself in a lot of different ways to make the subscriptions framework not just work in release 5, but release 4, release 4B. And so, because in our market, in the US market for the primarily the Argonaut project, we don't expect folks to go to FHIR release 5. And I say we don't expect, shouldn't say we don't expect in the next 12 months. And no vendor has stepped forward to say, no one has stepped forward to say we're committed to R5 at this time. And in fact, for the national profiles at the last April 7 meeting, we made an agreement that next year when we do a new update to our national US core profiles, we're going to stick with FHIR release 4. And that's because we have market saturation, like it's huge adoption. And so it'll be lots of disruption trying to force people to uplift it. But anyway, Gino's done a ton of work to make that happen and gave an excellent talk on this yesterday. So CDS hook support. This is an older project, and this is one of these projects I scratched my head a little bit about it because it's such a powerful thing to have remote clinical decision support at the point of care within the provider workflow. When you're placing an order, we're doing a patient view, there's these little hooks that can then present information. There's been a few releases on this guide. If you're brand new, there's a quick start guide to kind of give you a little background on it. There's a sandbox. The Argonaut community did do another example of a kind of a security risk assessment of this project. But just here's a picture when people, this is the kind of common CDS hooks picture of, at order entry, it goes out to an external service. That service can actually query back. So you can send kind of pre-set of information for the service, maybe a condition and a medication, but if the CDS service needs more information, it can actually call back into the EHR to get additional information. And in that callback, when it's complete, it can present kind of this card, a suggestion that you can actually click and then switch to a medication, or it can even provide a smart app to then launch to do whatever functionality you like. And the reason I scratch my head a bit about CDS hooks is there's a ton of momentum for this project about 5 years ago. And there's one kind of major EHR vendor that has implemented it and supports it. But a lot of others have kind of put a toe in the water on this one. And so it hasn't taken over kind of the industry yet, but it's a very solid spec. The folks who spend it were very thoughtful in it. And so I think any country that's looking at remote decision support, there's no reason you'd pick anything except this project. And it was funny in preparation for this, I looked across the agenda and thought, I wonder if anyone's talking about CDS hooks this week. And there's actually 2 projects out there. CDS hooks for accessing CQL using Amazon Health Lake, and then leveraging CQL and CDS hooks enhanced clinical decision support by 2 different companies, 2 different folks. It's a sign that I still think there's room for this project to really take off. Okay, so Argonaut 2023. Selecting projects the talk this morning is like, are there interoperability, like where does interoperability work? Or AWAT said that, and it's funny. What we do is we say, what products do you want to solve this year? What things are your customers complaining about? And so at the start of the year, we just collect any project that someone wants to work on. And so it doesn't take long for us to have a pretty good list. And so last year we had 26 ideas that folks want to work on. And we can do about 4, maybe 5 if we're lucky. And so one of the ways we whittled down this list, if you want to make a software engineer or business analyst kind of do a little work, make them create 2 slides. Okay, so the 2 slides, basically like there's like 4 questions on these 2 slides. And how many projects do you think went down? So we're at 25. Anyone want to guess how many went to by requiring 2 slides?
10.
pretty good. We went to 12. Okay. So it didn't take much, for folks to step forward. So the 12 projects, and I know it's a little bit tricky to read, and I'll just cruise through a few that, so the idea is then you have to pitch these slides. So I don't know, it's not quite Shark Tank for folks who ever watched the show where like people pitch their new product ideas, but the idea is you're putting yourself out there on behalf of your company to say, hey, we're committed to this. This is why it's a good idea for your customers, and then sell it to the rest of the Argonaut community. And so, one that's come up a few times, patient requests for corrections, an automated way to say, I want to submit there's something wrong with my record. This has been pitched a few times, but the EHR vendor, the vendors have said, yeah, that's interesting, but we're not quite ready to do that yet. I think there's still potential that will continue to be on our list and will actually be a project. But so these are the dozen projects that were pitched this year. And after, if you get access, when you get access to this presentation, you can click. I've included the links to the kind of 2-slide pitches that folks gave. But in terms of the actual projects that were selected, this is the list in the rough timeline. So API access to imaging, vitals, continuing US core design, this assessment sprint, secure messaging, and patient access brands. And I'll give you just a really quick high-level overview of each of these and where we are. So the first is API access to images. These are full projects, and I guess I didn't define what full projects are. Full projects are like 6 months or longer. We have a kind of a self-imposed rule in the Argonaut community. I don't know when it started, but the rule is like, you got to do it within a year, okay? If it goes longer than a year, these standards projects can just roll and roll forever. And so at the end of the year, we do our best to like wrap up a project, at least have the useful pieces published. Folks can take it or leave it, and maybe we'll come back to it. So like CDS hooks, we've come back to a few times, subscriptions a few times. But the full projects are at least 6-month-ish projects. The mini projects are supposed to be, 2 or 3 months. I think this was a creative way to have us take on more projects. Because we used to only take on like 3 for the year, and folks were like, well, what if we made it a mini? Like, that's not a big project. That's how that got started, I think. So first is API access to imaging. So in the US market, we are allowed to bring our own apps to connect and download our healthcare data. We can download allergies, problems, medications, labs, everything that US core spec, essentially, we have access to through those apps. There's kind of a big piece. We're missing access to images, and images are something patients want, providers want access to it. And so the idea is, how do we use the same authorization access framework to download that other information for images? Your record isn't complete unless you also have your images. And one of the simple use cases, I call it simple, but when you want to do a referral, so this is an example, like Rochester Mayo, a major hospital in Minnesota, has some tools for analyzing kidneys. And so how cool would it be if you had a CT scan of your kidney that you could run it through this other tool that some advanced, institution has built. And so you're not reliant on whatever your provider has. And the one on the right is in cardiology, cardiovascular MRI, basically, of the heart. And so you're not just restricted to what is available at your clinic. And I joke a little bit with Josh. Josh Mandel is actually leading this project, and he likes to throw this in here. And I don't know if I'll throw it in for you Friday, because he's going to talk on Friday, is he wants to order coasters of his brain, because I should have access and do whatever I want with my images. And so if I had it, this is what I do. So if you want a coaster of Josh's brain, you can see if he'll share it with you, and then you can upload a Shutterfly and buy some coasters. But so the question is, like, what exists today? There's kind of these business to business networks. There is some access within a hospital, so it's very common where a radiology results interface will send like this accession number to the EHR, and the EHR can access that image, but it's only within that network. If you were to share that link externally, you're not able to access that. There was some prior work done with Sync for Science, and the idea is FHIR to search for the studies that were done, and then DICOM to actually retrieve the images. And so they're kind of the project is around enhancing that particular specification. One thing that was unique to this project that wasn't in other projects is the Argonaut members aren't the only ones that need to participate. There's kind of the PACs, the risk PACs environment of, they're the ones who have access to the images and manages those images. And so the agreement was made that we would do this project if they were willing to participate. And so we did a little bit of reaching out to some of, I think we reached like 6 major PACs vendors to say, hey, here's a cool project, we'll work with you on this. And we got a little interest. So 3 of them said, yeah, they'll step up and work on it. And so that resulted in us taking it on as a formal project. And we made some pretty good project progress. I think the spec is looking good, but we're in the phase where, you know, these projects all start with like a ramp up initial design. And then you get to that phase of like, who's actually going to write some code to test this? And so that's where we are right now. And I think the summer will be telling to see where this is going to go, because if you don't test the spec, you know, you don't know where the flaws are, and then it's hard to get it to roll out to the broader community. But check out, it was kind of a late minute addition to the program here, but Josh is giving a talk on smart imaging access this Friday for folks who are interested in kind of additional detail on image access. Okay, so this next is a pitch that's a little bit more standardized in terms of what we've done, is this question of what problem are we solving and is there an existing solution? And so this is FHIR right. Who's been successful with FHIR right? In a little bit here. Okay, so we've tried. 2021, we spent like 6 months on FHIR right, and we kicked off the project like FHIR right. How hard could this be? What do you guys want to write? And every vendor had an own idea of what they wanted to write and their rules. And hey, if a patient uploads data, we got to add a special tag to say it was a patient uploaded data tag. And if a provider accepts it, then you can remove it and all this stuff. And I don't want to say we were like lost in the forest for part of that year, but there's a bit of wandering around of like, man, you know, it was kind of like a year where we collected a lot of problems. And it's since a year, we only spent about 6 months on it. Well, what we realized is if you're going to do FHIR right, back into an EHR where folks are very particular, or providers are particular about what gets written into, like, don't want to say their record, but the idea there's some paternalism in terms of owning that information. We got to be very careful about the data type we pick. And so we agreed this year we would do FHIR right again, but we're focusing on a vital sign. We all agree on the line codes. The values are fairly straightforward. And we believe that we could enable this kind of through provider in that kind of smart app launch workflow, or even a patient. And so we'll see. So we need, you know, who needs to participate to make this successful? What does the success look like? So, you know, we need obviously EHR and app developers to participate. And the end goal is, you know, creation of an IG to kind of support the mechanics of this, and then successful testing of that IG with an app. Okay, US CDI design sprints. I've talked a lot about US core. So every year we host this kind of set of design sprints to review the new elements our national government has proposed. So it looks like this year we're going to be doing some elements around potentially imaging, because there's rumblings that that's a potential requirement, and a variety of others. There's some new kind of lab requirements around specimen that we haven't done before. And so that will be done this year, but cruise through it. That's a yearly thing. And then one that kind of came up out of the blue is assessments. There are a lot of assessments in healthcare. There's kind of like these formalized instruments where these formal set of questions are meant to be asked. I mentioned kind of the social determinants of health. We have like a set of questions to assess like food insecurity, a set of questions that another project in the US market, Gravity, worked on. But in terms of standardizing exactly how those are exchanged, we've struggled a little bit about using kind of the observation class or observation resource versus using questionnaire response to formalize all those questions in a kind of a formalized instrument. And the feedback we got from the EHR clinical community, and even my own like experience as a patient, is providers kind of tweak the questions. They're not exactly matching what the, you know, psychometric formalized assessment instruments are. And so using questionnaire response, which is supposed to be an exact replica of what was there, isn't necessarily like a true fit of what's going on. And so we wrestled with this and updated. We did a kind of a short 4-week back-to-back call to really hammer on the guidance and add that to the specification that was published this May. Patient provider messaging. I don't know, who has more than one portal that they log into if they communicate with their provider? All right. If you go to different providers, oh man, so it's funny how different parts and different, so in the US, like depending on where you live, you may have one provider that provides care all over. And so you have one portal to communicate with your provider, or you live in like rural parts where it's not like a big city. Even in Massachusetts, which is a fairly dense city, there's like, I had like 6 portals in like a 10-mile radius because every doctor has their own portal to communicate and different platform. And so this project was all about how do we have an app to communicate to those portals without having to log into each of them. And part of this is folks envision a world where like you have a diabetes management platform or other tools that are, in your own app, and you don't want to have to copy paste your results into the portal. Maybe if you only have one portal, maybe you're gonna have a few apps to manage chronic conditions. You don't have to copy and paste and move that in there. So this is a really quick effort. I would say it's a toe in the water because this is a huge problem to solve. But we wrote some initial guidance because one of the members is actually implementing this right now and didn't want to just invent their own, but wanted to at least have the community provide input into what they're doing. Publication endpoint structure. I talked about this a bunch earlier about helping patients providers find their endpoints. And we did another little sprint this year. We actually had a call last week and did another connectathon. And so there's a link here to the spec for folks who want to check out what we've kind of settled on. And I think we will iterate on this a few more times, and this will actually be formalized as a standard. So one of the jokes this last year is like, what is Argonaut? Because, in HL7, we have these accelerators like, oh, we're the payer accelerator, we're the whatever accelerator, the social care accelerator, we're the research accelerator. And so one of the recent jokes at the last working group meeting is for folks who are called BASF, which is a major worldwide company, of like, we don't make a lot of the products people buy, we make a lot of products you buy better. And so the way we think of Argonaut, or I shouldn't say the way, we're still testing this out, is that at Argonaut, we don't make the FHIR APIs you deploy, we make them a little bit better, and trying to define additional rules and guidance and kind of formalizing the baseline rules around it. So how to participate? There's a Zulip channel, a Confluence page. Engage the community. These specs are only as good as folks who give feedback and actually test them out. It's pretty easy for developers to go back to their own world and just work on things. But when you find an error, every single page has a request to change. Please take 2 minutes to let us know. Play together. And hold on. How did it go this morning? What was this? What was this? I don't know. I tried to just sneak that in here. So, and that's all I got. So, thank you for joining me today, and I hope the rest of your dev days is good. I know I cruised through here. Are there any questions? What questions do folks have?
Well, thanks for your presentation. Yeah, it's time for some Q&A. There aren't any questions yet in the Whova app, so maybe if someone in the audience would like to ask a question. No questions. I have one for myself. So you mentioned that the CDS hook, that is not really implemented on a large scale.
Yeah.
Could you pinpoint to a reason as to why that is? Because you mentioned it has a solid specification, so.
Yeah, the only thing for that one is that some of the EHRs, have been around for 20 or 30 years. And so they've built in their own kind of native best practice alerts or other of their own functionality that's kind of self-contained. And the idea that reaching out to kind of remote server, they've just built the rules directly in, or I shouldn't say they provided tools for their customers to build those rules in and said, we're not sure we need a remote service, but a few vendors have in the US market said, the idea is how to get research into clinical care faster. And this is one of those ways of like push that information out, but I think it's primarily because they built their own functionality.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any questions, then we can finish up. Well, thanks for your presentation. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And please give some feedback on this session on devdays.com/feedback.
Awesome. Thank you.